Faith Science Podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the 7th Sunday after Pentecost for the week of July 7th, 2024. I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to get into this week's podcast, and I'm excited that we are in this continued season of growth. I'm excited that here in the States, this is a time that we talk about our independence as a nation, and that's kind of a fun and exciting time. But I think this week there'll be some real fun things of us wrestling with some different aspects of calling and what does this mean for us, along with the idea of what does it all mean to be trying to live in harmony and trying to be aware of what's going on around us. There's a lot of aspects of that to be thinking about and be considerate of, and sometimes those decisions are very difficult. But before we jump into it, let's look back to last week's question, which was, where can we restore? And one of the responses I got back this last week I thought was really insightful. He talked about how his wife had planted a cover crop, basically, and how that's been helpful in their garden bed, but also out in their lawn and different things like that, especially living in the area that I know that this person's living in, most likely somewhat sandy soil. And I think that's an important thing for us to think about and to remember. It's like our faith. The more we work it, the deeper our roots go, the harder it clamps in, and the more depth that there actually is to our faith. There's so many different places when I'm going through things where you can tell the depth of faith sometimes is lacking, and sometimes it's really hard and frustrating because you want people to have that, but the only thing that can come from it is time, work, and effort. The more you work the muscle, the stronger it gets. And thus, it's the same type of thing with these plants. These plants are putting down roots to really be able to solidify the soil, being able to help make that land more resilient, and making it actually a stronger and healthier landscape. And that was kind of one of the things we got into last week. And I think within our faith, we should be figuring out those ways to continue to put in those nutrients into our faith that we need, but also figuring out things that are going to strengthen and make sure that soil is solid. And I think sometimes that's something that we can often overlook, or we get into this consumption phase and not okay, well, what does this actually mean in wrestling phase, which is needed for us to be able to grow in our own faith. So let's just jump into it this week. The semi-continuous first reading for this week is from 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 1 to 5 and 9 and 10. This picks up a little bit again where we were last week. We had, remember, Saul and Jonathan killed last week. We had the laments then from David. And now it's the people coming to David and stating, look, we understand that Saul was the king, but we also recognize that the Lord, through Ezekiel, has anointed you to be the next king of Israel, and we want you to now step into that. And it's one of those things where you can tell there's a little hesitancy within David even in this moment, but it's also him then stepping into that and recognizing that God is working through him and is going to build out this great kingdom of what David actually does while being king. The psalm that goes with that then is Psalm 48, all 14 verses of it. And this is the recognition again of how God is above, that they're bringing these leaders, or in this case, kings, together to be able to hear the voice of God and live that out, which means being able to see and understand the love that God has for his people, and recognizing that then we should be rejoicing in that and being able to share that with other people, thus having God being able to show that love forevermore. The other Old Testament text you can use this week is from Ezekiel chapter 2, verses 1 to 5. This is the beginning of the call story here of Ezekiel, and God coming to Ezekiel and stating, "You are mortal. I'm sending you to these people of Israel, a nation of rebels," coming from verse 3, that they have continued to have issues and transgress against me, but yet, just because they're stubborn, I am still sending you out, and thus says the Lord, and being able to fulfill and reach out even as a prophet, recognizing that it's going to be difficult, but I have a role in mind for you. You just need to go out. So the psalm that goes with that then is Psalm 123, all 4 verses of it. And so we get this, again, the idea of almost like the prophet recognizing, lifting their eyes into the heavens and recognizing that it's God who is over all this and is helping to guide them in which way that they should be going. Have mercy on me, O Lord. Have mercy upon us, for we have had more than enough contempt. Coming from verse 3. Our souls have had more than its fill of scorn of those who are at ease, of contempt of the proud. This idea of how we need to keep looking to God and recognizing it's the Spirit within us that is guiding us and making sure that we don't put ourselves too high and mighty amongst that as well. The second reading or epistle text this week then is from 2 Corinthians chapter 12 verses 2 to 10. This is a little bit of a weird text this week. It's Paul writing here and talking about how he's had this intimate relationship with God, even mentions like a third heaven as we get in verse 2, this kind of, again, which goes into some Jewish thought of the time. But again, this idea here of getting to this intimate relationship that he has had in the time spent with Jesus and recognizing that the grace that God has for us is sufficient and that the power is made perfect in your weakness, coming from verse 9. So this idea of Christ dwelling within us, being able to take our mistakes, being able to take our hardships, being able to take the difficulties of things and make them for the betterment of what God is trying to do. It's not that we're not trying. It's not that we're not going out and doing the best that we possibly can. And that's not what Paul's getting at. It's the idea of when we are falling short, even as we are giving our best effort, it's that God is working in and amongst us to be able to fulfill that extra gap where we fall short. It's not a God of gaps. It's a God of we work as hard as we can, and God uses that to be able to fulfill what God has intended all along. The gospel text this week is out of Mark chapter 6, the first 13 verses of it. And this is a fun, interesting text, and I think there's times where it's difficult, but I think, again, where we'll be getting to this week, I think is helpful for us to get our heads around. But Jesus returns to his hometown with his disciples. So on the Sabbath, he goes to the synagogue, and people are astounded by what he's saying. Some of the wisdom and all this, but then there's also the chatter of, is this not the son of Mary and brothers of James and Josue and Judas and Simon and his sisters are here? They're putting together the pieces of this is his hometown kid. And Jesus responds in verse 4, prophets are not without honor except in their hometown and among their own kin and in their own house. So Jesus does a few small healings of sick people and curing them, coming from verse 5. But again, it's just not as powerful and successful as he's had in other places. So he sends the 12 out 2 by 2, giving them the authority to cast out unclean spirits, and then giving them specific instructions on when you're entering the house and how you should be talking and how are you taking cash and what they should be bringing for this, and gets very specific, and if you're welcomed in and if you're not welcomed in. But then we get here at the end that they were able to cast out demons and anointed with oil many people who were sick and cured them. So this specific instructions of what Jesus gave the disciples to do at this time, and then being able to adjust the model, as we'll get into, and then being able to still have significant impact in that area. So before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do our shameless plugs. Working Preacher, if you've been a Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between their sermon brainwaves, podcasts, their commentaries, their discussions. Since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas and direction and just some great thought to be able to think about these different texts. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. But I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, but they also have art, prayers, hymns, liturgical colors, even a daily devotion. We know how important this type of stuff can be. And I find this such a great resource, being able to think about how are different people artistically looking at this? How are different people taking these and being able to make prayers for Sunday or even just preparing you for worship? What are some different daily devotions to kind of keep me going week to week? It's an amazing, great resource. So if you haven't checked out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, I'd highly recommend that. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly newsletter or a monthly newsletter that goes through a wide variety of ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies to be able to bring into your weekly preaching, along with different events and different things that are going on around the Upper Midwest and beyond. If you enjoy listening to my podcast for about a half an hour each week, you're going to enjoy getting this stuff in your inbox. So if you haven't checked that out, I'd highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publications. Links to that will be down in the show notes. One of the things that we have talked about multiple times over in this podcast is how we as humans need to make sure that we're thinking about our interactions with nature and how are we interacting with God's creation that is beyond just us as humans, if that makes sense. The idea of how we are part of the creation, not separate from it. So thus, as we continue to study and grow, we start to better understand what fully our impact has been at different times and different places, for better and for worse. And so sometimes then our decision is, can we try to make things better by adjusting things? And we know that within science, you like to be able to adjust one variable at a time, but specifically when we're dealing with ecosystems, it is hard to be able to just test one variable. There's always more variables that we need to be thinking about at any given time. One of the stories that we have talked about again multiple times in the podcast is the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone in the mid-1990s, 1995, and how that has impacted not only Yellowstone, but the surrounding Montana and into Idaho, how that has drastically changed the ecosystem, is drastically changed even erosion, animal populations, and have watched how the ecosystem has flourished with the idea of having wolves reintroduced to that area. As we have done that, there has still definitely been challenges that we haven't talked about as much in this podcast, but I think there's been something that's been going on over the last 5 years or so that I think is worth some discussion, and I think it ties into our text. So give me a few minutes to lay this story out, and we'll get to how does this all tie in. But in 2020, Colorado decided to put together a Proposition 114. And this proposition was to introduce wolves back into Colorado. They had been eradicated from the state since roughly about 1940. So this plan then was to bring wolves back, and part of their whole promotion of this was to be able to rewild Colorado or help the environment in the long run, being able to help with erosion and be able to grow and be able to stimulate the ecosystem to be healthier for the long run, being able to help it grow, if you want to put it that way, and become a healthier ecosystem. And this wasn't without critics, because one of the biggest things that has also changed in Colorado over that same period of time, especially since the wolves have been eradicated, is that you have more and more ranchers in Colorado, and you're wanting these big, wide open ranches where they can have free range cattle. And so one of the biggest issues that they have run into is, and even when they were initially looking at putting this out there, was, well, what are you going to do for my cattle on if a wolf is taking out these cattle? And so this has been one of the things as they are trying to contemplate and consider what do we look at and doing, as the proposition in 2020 was narrowly passed. And it's very narrowly passed. The percentages were 50.91% voting yes for the proposition of reintroducing wolves into Colorado versus 49.09%. So a narrow pass to be able to have this. And this is neat because this is without federal regulation. This is coming in just from the state deciding to do this. So one of the things then has been is, okay, what do we do about this rancher problem? Yes, we can give some money for taking out cattle, but is there anything that we can do to be able to potentially protect our cattle? Because wolves, if they get this understanding of these are a fairly defenseless animal, they aren't bison, they aren't necessarily bred to be still fierce competitors for the wolf to be able to do that, they can look like an easy meal to a pack of wolves. And there has been some early indications that there has been a few issues with this. Now, the plan was to release between 30 and 50 wolves over a period of time here over the next 5 years. And they had to have beginning of the release by the end of last year. So right around Christmas last year, 2023, they released some wolves into the environment. And again, by April, they're starting to have issues, and you're starting to get news stories talking about how there's had a few of these incidents running in with cattle. This is an ongoing thing. This is something that they're still trying to figure out and balance. There has been some discussion about when the wolves get to certain populations, can we suddenly make them a game animal so that we can help control population? But part of it also was the wolves coming in, and you're wanting it to be able to make sure that you're getting the natural levels closer to what they would have been. Is that enough? Is that not enough? It's hard to tell. So it's this constant back and forth trying to figure out how do we figure this stuff out. And honestly, it kind of leaves you in this questioning spot of what do we do? We want to reintroduce wolves to help the environment long term, to be able to help with erosion, help with elk populations, moving them around, help with being able to stimulate the natural wildlife of Colorado to be more wild, to be more resilient, to be stronger. But now we also have this issue of livestock in the current form that it was not here when wolves were last here. And in fact, part of the removal of wolves was due to having the livestock. So how do we have this balance that we're able to go back and forth with? And it's something that is going to be continued to work on and look at. And as I've argued, there are, I think, ways to be able to utilize this, and that's part of the discussions of, is there ways to be able to get so that these packs are, over a 3 to 5 year time period, stable, that it's still doing the natural effects to be able to help the environment, but also still able to be somewhat held under control to help these ranchers so they aren't having tremendous losses all the time. I would argue from some of my basic research, it also might be worth looking at investing in dogs that are really just purely designed for work dogs to protect the cattle and different things of that nature. Might be worth it, but I'm not entirely sure. I haven't done a ton of research on that. But it's this, again, idea of how there's going to have to be give and take. There's going to have to be compromise. There's going to have to be a tweaking of our mindset to be able to have both being able to coexist and work together. This, to me, is a lot of what Jesus is doing in the gospel text this week. Jesus comes in and it goes to the synagogue and is preaching, and he gets the responses that we have heard in other places that he has been. Being able to, wow, the wisdom, all the astonishment. But at the same time, you're getting these, but isn't this the person that we watched grow up? Don't we know who his parents were? What do you mean? Why should I suddenly just change my whole life because I remember this guy in diapers? I remember watching this guy grow up. I know all the mistakes that this person has ever made. I remember him. He was all that unbelief. Jesus is amazed with the unbelief coming from verse 6 because they know all the history. But also, I think it's a growing moment for Jesus entirely, and God as a part too, that this model can't just be totally duplicated everywhere that we go without thought. Jesus then tweaks what Jesus is doing. Instead of going and preaching in the synagogues, which leads to people, wow, this is such a great prophet, and bringing all the sick and everything to him, they're getting the doubt. So Jesus decides, I have my 12 disciples. I am going to equip them to be able to go out, and they will come back. And I will tell them what to do and what they should be able to bring and all the different things to worry about, what not to be worrying about, all that different things. Send them out. You guys come back, and then we'll talk about it. It empowers them. We're able to still do the mission of what I'm here to do. I'm just not physically doing it because my physical presence at this moment isn't going to work well. The way that we have been doing ranching without wolves may or may not be able to be done now. But the aspect of having wolves in the environment can also be really beneficial. So it's this compromise of figuring out, we would love to have wolves, but we have also this ranching environment. How do we get so that these two are somewhat playing together? Is there a time and place to be taking out some of these wolves so they don't learn to take livestock? That they learn over time this is a place that you don't go so that they are able to protect the livestock. Is there ways of doing that? I don't know. I think there's aspects here, and that's one of the things that Colorado is looking at currently and trying to figure this out. They're trying to look for the long-term future health of the environment of Colorado, which I give them a lot of props for. But while they have, things have changed since the last time wolves were there. So now they have a couple other difficulties that they're trying to overcome. And so they are trying to slowly figure out the plan as they're releasing these slowly to figure out how do we be able to have both of these coexist. And I see this as really poignant, especially to the gospel text. But I think when we look at these other texts and think about what we've been going through, thinking about 2 Samuel and how the Israelites encouraging David, encouraging him and saying, yes, you can do this. You have been chosen. Yes, we've gone through this morning, but we know that the God is with you, and so that you should then lead us and help us be the people of God that God is calling us to be. You look at rising the prophet of Ezekiel, and it's even talked about that they are stubborn people. They are a nation of rebels. God preparing, saying it's going to be difficult work, but I'm still needing you. And we realize that Ezekiel is one of the great prophets that we get, being able to help lead the people where they need to be able to go, even though they sometimes are extremely boneheaded. And boy, does that sound familiar to people like me and you. And how the 2 Corinthians text talks about how we want to have this intimate relationship and realizing that even when we don't get it to the way that we think it should be, that God still works with it. And God still is able to use that and bring it to a place that we aren't able to. I give huge props to the people of Colorado. I know that's a really difficult decision. I realize it's really hard to be able to try balancing livestock and economy with the natural environment and the long-term health and trying to get those two to mix. I give them a lot of props. It's not an easy thing that they're trying to do. There's a lot of difficult decisions and a lot of observations and a lot of additional work that's going to need to be done. But I think the initial framework of trying to slowly release wolves over a 3 to 5 year period, trying to slowly build up the pack, and then having discussions, how do we both protect the wolves while also protecting the livestock, and figuring that balance out as they're slowly going through this. I give them a lot of respect. And I see that as they are in this moment of Jesus giving that message and getting a mixed result, which is exactly what the people voted in 2020. And now you're starting to have the early results, and people, there's tension. You can tell just from afar that there is some still tension about this, but trying to figure out a way forward that's healthier for the environment and healthy for the people and healthy still for the economy of Colorado. And that's a hard balance to be working, but it's also important work for us as a world and a nation to be recognizing. Just because something is super successful somewhere else doesn't mean that there still doesn't need to be a lot of thought and considerations that are brought in at using what we learned from the last reintroduction to now. A lot of things had changed. I think one of the things that we can even see from this is Jesus, I think, gets the impression of this is going to be easy. And then he gets these quotes coming from the end where it's like, oh, the prophet's always rejected everywhere else, has honor everywhere else. This idea of how Jesus isn't necessarily respecting how much Jesus has changed and the people have changed. And so thus the approach needs to change. Wolves were in Colorado. The environment has changed. So now the approach, even though we've seen what's happened in Yellowstone and seen the amazing things that's happened, realizing the approach on how we're going to have to do this is going to have to be a little bit different here. And it's still that we can't get the amazing results long term, but we still have to put a lot of thought, work, and effort and still be able to adapt and change and give and take. Compromise is so important with something like this. So, the question I have for you this week is, where do we have to compromise as people? Where do we need to compromise as people? I think there's a lot of times that we like trying to repeat history, and there is times where the old adage being history doesn't necessarily repeat, but it often rhymes. The idea that we can learn a lot from the past, but also recognizing in the march forward, we can't just try to redo exactly what we did last time. Sometimes we need to be able to think creatively and take what we have learned and modify it to be able to fit the situation we're in. And I think so often within our faith, within our churches, within life in general, there's so many times we romanticize nostalgia and the past and we try to bring it back to where the way it was. And we often miss the potential of the future because we're just trying to repeat the past, which we can't repeat. And as a person that's still, I would say, youngish within the church, I think that's one of the things that I just hear and see in so many different places that I'm in, that we're trying to repeat history. We're trying to go back to the way things were. And it's like, this is stuff before I was born. This is stuff before I can remember really being at church. And I'm sorry, the world has changed in that time. And I think it doesn't mean that we can't learn from it, but I think it also means that we have things to be able to reconsider and take some of those things and say, how do we modernize this and moving forward? How do we take what we've learned and move forward in a new direction? And I think that's where as a church and where as a world within many different things we need to keep doing. We can't look backwards. We can't just immediately jump to the future. We have to be able to take what we've learned and slowly move forward in a responsible way. And sometimes that's very difficult. It means a lot of compromise needs to happen. But also, we then start seeing the empowerment and the progress that people are looking for. And I think that's where what we see in the gospel text this week, Jesus now empowers the disciples by doing this, and the mission is able to happen. Even though it was different than what Jesus probably initially expected to be doing, it probably worked for the long-term betterment of the church, long-term betterment of the faith, and it makes what is said in 2 Corinthians all the more true. My grace is sufficient for you, for the power is made perfect in weakness. Just because we do not feel like we are equipped, just because we feel like this is very difficult, does not mean that we are not told to still go out and do it. And be able to go forward and do our best, and God is going to help take what we have and still make it to the betterment of what God is intending. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.